today. The weapon that I'm carrying, I'm dressed as a regular British soldier, and the weapon that I'm carrying was the British Standard, the Brown Bess musket. So these weapons, you can load in front of them every 15 seconds. So the British Standard was to get 4 shots off every minute. And that's making them some of the quickest troops in the world. What James has there, James is dressed as a regular militiaman, and what he's carrying onto the battlefield is anything that he would have that belongs to him. So he's carrying his personal weapons, his personal hunting rifle onto the battlefield, and he's brought a Pennsylvania rifle with him. So they are a little bit different. That's a rifle, this is a musket, and I'll get into it a little bit later on, the difference between them, but most of the things between these things are very, very similar. First of all, the same loading procedure, same misfire rate, and as well the same issues plaguing them with that black powder. So these are both black powder weapons, and to load them, what you're doing, you're opening up the frizzen, which is a hardened steel, to expose the pan underneath. And you can imagine that pan just being almost like a small spoon. And that's what you're going to use to cup and hold the black powder, which will eventually act as your prime. Once you've opened that up, you're going to reach back into your cartouche. So it's the black leather box all the soldiers carry with them. Then you're going to take out a cartridge. So these cartridges are just paper tubes filled with a couple grains of black powder. And at the bottom would be a musket ball tied in. So for me, I'm carrying a 68 to 71 caliber musket ball. And James would be carrying a 45 caliber musket ball. Or rifle ball rather. So reaching back, bring that up to your mouth. Rip that top open, rip the paper open to get to that black powder inside. You're pouring a few grains into your pan for your prime. Close that, bring the musket in front of you, and the rest is going down the barrel with that ball going in last and sitting on top. You're then taking your ramrod out, forcing everything down the barrel, right? So making sure it's sitting right beside the firing mechanism. Take your ramrod out, put it back in the furniture, back where it belongs, and you can now fire your one shot. So to fire that shot off, pulling back the hammer, you can see the hard, sharp stone attached to it, the flint right there. So when you pull the trigger, that flint flies forward, hits that hardened steel, and that's hopefully going to create sparks. Those sparks will hopefully land in your pan, hopefully ignite that black powder you put there as your prime. That will hopefully cause a small explosion to travel through a vent hole or a small hole on the side of the barrel, which then hopefully ignite the black powder inside the barrel, and that'll set your musket ball off. Hopefully, right? So like I said, there's a lot of hoping, wishing, and praying with these weapons, and that is because they do have a 30% misfire rate. And again, that misfire rate is because of this flintlock mechanism. So it's a fairly primitive weapon system. You're taking a stone, you're hitting metal, you're hoping for sparks. It's not going to work every time. That flint, that stone, is going to start to chip away, start to dull, and eventually you're going to need to replace it. It's also not covered up, right? So if it's windy outside like it is today, those sparks can get blown away from the pan, never contact your black powder, and again, never fire off this weapon. If it's raining outside, anything gets wet, it's not going to spark, it's not going to fire. That black powder gets wet, it's going to turn into a black goo, it's not going to ignite, it's not going to fire. Another problem with the weapon is the black powder itself. So black powder is very dirty, very filthy substance. Every time you fire this weapon, this black powder fouling is building up on the outside of the lock and on the inside of the barrel. So what they do to compensate for that is make the musket ball smaller in size to this barrel. So again, 68 caliber musket ball going down a 75 caliber barrel. That size difference is gonna allow you to load at 15 seconds for a much longer, much more consistent period of time. But now when you fire off this weapon, that ball has room to bounce and rattle all the way out, so it's leaving them also weird and wonky angles. So this weapon, it's only accurate up to about 50 to 75 yards. At that distance, so you guys imagine kind of where you're standing here right now, to the artillery park behind you where all those cannons are. At that distance, you could hit a man-sized target 9 out of 10 times. Past that, say you try to hit that cannon on the other side of that bastion over there, Brock's Bastion, about 150 yards, you could theoretically miss your target by about 8 feet in any direction. Okay, so this is not a sniper's weapon by any means. That weapon right there, that rifle, that was a sniper's weapon, right? So the difference between a rifle and a musket is completely smooth on the inside, whereas a rifle has rifle grooves cut that spiral down. So when you loaded that rifle, it's a tight-fitting ball. Again, it's a 45 caliber musket ball, or 45 caliber rifle ball going down a 45 caliber barrel. So it's tight-fitting, you're forcing it down that barrel, down those grooves. So when you fire it off that rifle, that ball is going to catch the grooves and it's going to put a spin on the ball. That spin is going to stabilize that ball, allow that ball to travel much further, much more accurately. So that rifle is accurate up to 300 yards away. The problem with the rifle is that because it is a tight-fitting ball, you're forcing it down the barrel. The first shot takes about 30 seconds to load. Then it's still a black powder weapon, so that black powder fouling is again building up inside the barrel, building up inside those grooves, so each subsequent shot gets harder and harder and harder to load. You're adding about 5 to 10 seconds to each reload time, and by your 15th or 20th shot, if you can even still load your rifle, it's taking you almost a minute and a half to 2 minutes to load it. This thing is at 15 seconds for upwards of 80 to 100 shots. So that's where the advantage of the musket comes from. It comes from that speed and essentially that longevity, that consistency on the battlefield. So we can go out, we're going to fire off two shooting procedure once again, so you can see how I'm properly loading the musket. Then my second shot, I'll try to load it as quickly as I can, and hopefully I can hit that 15-second benchmark for you guys.
Že to nenabíjí jako většinou k nám teda.
To jsem nečekala.
Já nechápu, že tu tyčku jakoby si furt tam zastrkává do toho, že si nedá jenom rychle někam jakoby... No, jakoby, no, že co ne...
Tak asi třeba to tak možná je. Tady prodáš. Se sleknu.
Já doufám, že jsem natáčel to, já to dám jakoby bokem, to jak to vysvětlovat
So
to
yeah, the
nebudu.
first step, bring the weapon to your left shoulder. That's how you're going to march into battle with it. You want to bring it over to the right side of your body so you have access to your firing mechanism. Open up the prison, that hardened steel, to expose the pan underneath. Reaching back into your cartouche, taking out a cartridge and biting the top off. Grabbing the weapon, and then bringing the musket in front of you, load the rest down the barrel. Forcing everything down with your ramrod. And you can now fire your one shot.
To dělá jako co nejrychleji.
No, ukazuje to, že to má hotový za těch, že to má prostě za těch 15 vteřin, že to trvalo díl.
There you go, 2 shots of the brown mess, 2 shots out of the rifle, only the one misfire. Just throwing in there for some more fun for you guys. And you guys, you noticed all the smoke from just the one weapon going off. These 2 weapons actually with all that noise as well. Imagine that smoke just hanging there on that battlefield. That smoke was nicknamed the fog of war. That's one of the reasons why we're in these bright colored uniforms with the shoot me here crossbelts. Right? So it's used as an anti-camouflage. So of course they have knowledge of camouflage 200 years ago, but it's much more important on that battlefield to be able to distinguish your own troops from the enemy troops through that thick smoke, through that fog of war, so you don't have any friendly fire, and so you're able to pull off any offensive and defensive maneuvers. Now there was a secondary weapon to the British soldier, as well as any secondary weapons the militiaman could bring onto the battlefield. He's bringing, again, whatever weapons he has at home. So today James has got his tomahawk with him, as well as his trusty hunting knife. taking those onto the battlefield to do as much damage as he possibly could in hand-to-hand combat. Myself, I was issued a triangular socketed bayonet. 17 inches in cold hard British steel. You can load and fire the musket with this bayonet attached. The terrifying thing of this bayonet is that when you were stabbed with it, it would create a triangular wound. So you see that blade, it's not a flat blade, not like a knife or a sword. That blade is actually raised in the middle. And so it makes it very, very difficult for the surgeon of the time period to sew that wound shut. Right? Because you want to sew the first and second side shut, and then you want to sew the third side shut. One of those first two sides could actually pop open from that third side closing up. If he does manage to stitch it shut, it doesn't take into account any internal damages that you would have suffered. And like I said, you can fire the musket with this bayonet attached, so this bayonet is getting covered in that black powder fouling. It's getting filthy, it's getting dirty, that wound is getting infected. That infection is going to lead to gangrene, and that's what's going to lead to your death. The only chance survival you had on that battlefield was if you were lucky enough to get hit in an arm or a leg, then at least you'd have the opportunity to have that amputated right then and there, and will hopefully be able to survive that very painful 45-second surgery. On that cheerful note, that's the end of our rifle our firing demonstration. If you guys do have questions, we'll stick around for a little bit. Otherwise, all the buildings are open. Go inside, have a look around, explore, and thank you very much for visiting Fort George.